It was another crowded Saturday night as Josie Arlington sat wearily on her plush couch, lit a cigarette, and silently observed the crowd gathered in her parlor. Standing around the lavishly decorated room were the most powerful men in New Orleans high society. Politicians, judges, lawyers, doctors, and even a police commander or two. And she knew the money would be flowing into her coffers once again. Most club owners would be ecstatic at such a large crowd, but not Josie Arlington. She dragged on her cigarette and bitterly whispered to herself, "What hypocrites!" For she also knew that not one of these gentlemen would dare acknowledge her presence outside the secretive walls of the club that bore her name, the Arlington. Josie Arlington was the most infamous madam in the most scandalous district in New Orleans, Storyville. Josie always said that the life of a madam chose her. She didn't choose it. She was orphaned at age 4, and the only parents she knew were the nuns at St. Elizabeth's home who took her in. But their attempts to scare the fear of God in her the years eventually drove her away, and straight onto the mean streets of New Orleans. Now, as crazy as New Orleans is these days, back in the 19th century, it was downright lecherous. There were red light districts all over town, and while the trade was not officially accepted, it was certainly tolerated. Josie knew where the real money was to be made and became a teenage prostitute under the control of an older lover. Life as a prostitute destroyed many women in New Orleans, but not Josie Arlington. As the years went by, she gained quite a reputation as a tough, no-nonsense woman of the night. She even got into a legendary fistfight with a rival prostitute, biting off parts of her lips and ears. But Josie knew she couldn't work as a prostitute forever, and to make a life for herself, she would have to take advantage of the very men who were taking advantage of her. She would have to become a madam. So Josie opened a bordello in one of the largest red light districts in New Orleans. The district was located along the Basin Street rail line, just a few blocks from the French Quarter. Despite her rowdy reputation, Josie wanted to clean up her image and open a refined establishment where true gentlemen could pay for the services of, as she put it, amiable foreign girls. While her brothel became quite successful, the city of New Orleans was about to make her richer than she could have imagined. In 1897, the city leaders decided upon a bold experiment. Rather than fight vices like prostitution and gambling, they decided to control them by confining them to one supervised area, the exact district where Josie had set up shop. The area was named Storyville, and it soon became an amusement park of sin. The densely packed neighborhood was filled with saloons and brothels. High-class gentlemen and rogues alike staggered through the streets, fueled by exotic drugs and overpriced booze, listening to the sounds of piano jazz in between trysts with the endless collection of prostitutes. And of all the bordellos in Storyville, none was larger and more lavish than the Arlington. Beautiful women in exotic European lingerie waited in the grand parlor for the most powerful men in New Orleans to walk through the door. But while Josie Arlington reveled in her upper-class status within the walls of Storyville, she soon found out she had a much different reputation within New Orleans high society. When Josie Arlington left the streets of Storyville on any given day, her male customers would suddenly look away when she passed them in the street. Some would grab the hands of their confused wives and dart to the other side of the street to avoid her approach. Even when she bought a mansion in one of New Orleans' most affluent neighborhoods, she was still an outcast among the high society women of New Orleans. She could hear them whispering and giggling behind her back when she came home at night. "I wonder how many of these ladies know that their husbands visit me on weekends," she thought to herself. But she kept silent, her bitterness festering inside her. In later years, Josie fell into ill health, and the piles of money she made at the Arlington began to seem meaningless. She began to fixate on her approaching death and knew it would provide her one more opportunity to get back at those who shunned her. So Josie Arlington shocked New Orleans one more time by purchasing a plot in Metairie Cemetery, the most expensive and fashionable graveyard in town. Now the high society women were truly mortified. They couldn't imagine a dirty, low-life prostitute being buried in the same cemetery as their loved ones, but there was nothing they could do. Metairie Cemetery was, and is to this day, one of the most impressive cemeteries you're ever likely to see. It's a bewildering maze of giant mausoleums and monuments, with some of the most powerful and well-known names in New Orleans history chiseled onto their stone facades. Josie Arlington knew she needed a special monument in Metairie Cemetery and commissioned an architect to design her a tomb unlike any other. The monument was made of red granite and topped with two flaming urns. A statue of a young woman bearing a wreath stood on the stairwell, touching the bronze door that led to Josie's future resting place. The tomb cost Josie a fortune, but the aggravation it caused the high society ladies was well worth the price. Josie eventually passed away at age 50. A few years later, Storyville itself was shut down by the U.S. Navy, which was concerned about the effect it was having on its young sailors stationed in New Orleans. The brothels and bars were leveled to build a housing project. There is no sign today that Storyville ever existed, but some believe that Josie Arlington stuck around long after the death of Storyville for one last bid for attention. In the years after Josie was buried, rumors began to spread about strange goings-on at her grave. Curiosity seekers who visited the grave ran back to town, claiming they saw the urns on top of the tomb burst into flames before their eyes. Others saw an eerie red glow coming from the tomb at night, as if the granite walls were burning like hot coals. Josie's grave was soon nicknamed the Flaming Tomb. Of course, the symbolism of a red light on Josie's tomb was not lost on many folks. Another rumor spread that the statue of the young girl would bang on the door of Josie's tomb, trying to get in. But Josie would never answer, since she had always claimed that no girl had ever lost her virginity at Arlington. But the reports didn't stop there. Two gravediggers swore they saw the female statue walk away from her post and wander aimlessly amongst the graves before vanishing. Was she really the ghost of Josie, still unable to find a home within the high society world she craved? As the story spread, the cemetery became overrun with visitors wanting to see the strange events for themselves. The families of those buried in the surrounding graves were horrified at the thought of their loved ones being trampled upon. So the cemetery agreed to remove Josie's remains and bury them in an unknown location. The Flaming Tomb was sold to another owner, strangely enough with the same initials, J.A. But next time you travel to New Orleans, you can still find Josie's old tomb deep in Metairie Cemetery. And even though Josie may not have found the acceptance she wanted in life, I imagine she'd be pleased to know that folks are still talking about her to this very day, and that her name, like Storyville itself, would pass into the history and mythology. That is unmistakably New Orleans. They say there are places on this planet that have seen such tragedy and sorrow that they are forever cursed. It's as if the earth itself holds some dark supernatural force beyond our understanding. A few years ago, I found such a cursed place just a few miles west of Atlanta, Georgia, a tiny hamlet called New Hope. And even though many people don't believe the story I'm about to tell, my visit there haunts my dreams to this day. At one time, I was a 35-year-old small business owner living in a tiny town in rural Virginia. I didn't have a brilliant business mind, but my father, a rabid Civil War hobbyist, had taught me to do one thing very well: hunt for Civil War artifacts, bullets, belt buckles, coins, and uniform buttons. The Virginia battlefields were full of them. Collectors from as far away as Germany and Japan paid top dollar for these rare artifacts. So I created a website to share my latest finds. I'm a bit ashamed to admit it now, but profit was much more important to me in those days than respect for the dead. It didn't matter to me if a battlefield was located on protected land or not. Under cover of darkness, I would sneak onto the property with my shovel and trusty metal detector. I would steal away as many artifacts as I could find. But other relic hunters quickly got in on the act and competition became fierce. Verbal threats and fistfights became common among rival hunters, and I knew it was time to hunt for relics elsewhere. I remembered studying about Union General William T. Sherman's devastating march to the sea in Georgia. I figured somewhere along that long path from Chattanooga, Tennessee, down through Atlanta, and south to Savannah, there must be a treasure trove of artifacts. So that spring, I hopped in my truck and drove south to Georgia to see what I could find. I was especially interested in a small town located near the Pickett's Mill battlefield called New Hope. It was here that one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War took place, the Battle of New Hope Church. And to understand my story, you must understand the carnage that took place there. It was May 1864, and General Sherman had begun his relentless march toward Atlanta. His men were hungry and battle-weary, but they knew that destroying Atlanta would mean destroying the heart of the Confederacy and finally bringing an end to this horrible war. Standing in Sherman's way was a stubborn Confederate army led by Joe Johnston. Johnston's men resisted the Union onslaught, forcing Sherman into flanking maneuvers. But like a bloody chess game, Johnston countered each of Sherman's moves, slamming his army into the Union forces day after day. It was during one of these flanking maneuvers that Sherman's men marched into the area of New Hope Church. What they didn't know was that Confederate forces were lying in wait with 16 cannons and some 5,000 men. As the Union troops struggled through the thick underbrush into the clearing, they were suddenly hit by a vicious firestorm of artillery. Confederate guns and cannons blasted away at them from behind makeshift log walls. The Union soldiers were sitting ducks. As the battle raged on, legend has it that a vicious thunderstorm blew into the area, a storm unlike anything the men had ever seen. The skies turned black as night. Lightning flashed and thunder boomed around the battlefield, sometimes drowning out the relentless artillery barrage. Wounded Union soldiers desperately crawled through the torrential rain into a ravine to escape certain death from the Confederate guns. And it was said that even with the storm and battle raging around them, one could still hear the agonizing moans of the wounded soldiers rising from the ravine. From that day forward, the Union troops gave a new name to the ravine near New Hope Church, Hell Hole. And like other battlefields, the Hell Hole and New Hope Church were rumored to be haunted. It had a reputation amongst learned Civil War historians as being a creepy and unsettling place. But I had heard plenty of ghost stories about the battlefields in Virginia, and they had never stopped me before. I drove into the town of New Hope just before sundown. It wasn't as much a town as it was a country intersection, with a small auto repair shop, a couple of churches, and a cemetery. But the historical markers lining the road betrayed its bloody past. I reasoned that the Confederate battle lines once spread out across the area where the cemetery now stands. There was a heavily wooded area beyond the graveyard, which I reasoned must have been the location of the Hell Hole. I spotted several homes on the other side of the woods. I decided to wait until nightfall to begin digging. I parked across the street behind one of the churches and waited. An hour later, I was blessed with a beautiful, clear night sky and a full moon. As I crept through the cemetery with my equipment, I noticed the tombstones seemed to reflect an eerie white light from the bright moon above. More faint-hearted relic hunters might have turned back at that point, but not me. I reached the woods and soon found myself struggling through a thick jungle of thorny bushes, vines, and trees. For a brief moment, I thought about what it must have been like to have been a solider back then, already weary and hungry, and now having to fight your way through this hellish Georgia forest. But then my thoughts drifted back to the business at hand. The ground suddenly sloped downward, and I figured I was on the lip of the ravine. Since the forest now enveloped me, I figured it was safe to use my flashlight. Shining it around the ravine, my heart sank. Some of the residents were now using the ravine as a garbage dump. There was plenty of scrap metal scattered about, including a rusted old car. But I had come this far, so I was going to at least give the place a try. I crept down into the ravine, chose an area that seemed the least polluted, and began clearing away some of the garbage. Once that was done, I swept the area with my metal detector and picked up plenty of readings. Whether or not this was from buried garbage, I did not know, but I soon began digging in earnest. In fact, I was so intent on my digging that I didn't notice a strange noise. Heavy raindrops plopping onto the thick canopy of leaves above. This seemed impossible to me, as the skies were beautifully clear just a few minutes before. But as the raindrops fell harder, I looked up into the sky and saw a sudden storm that had blackened out the stars and moon, leaving me in total darkness. A jarring blast of thunder shook the forest, and I quickly moved into the only shelter I could find, the inside of the junked car. I didn't want to run out of the woods and be caught. I hoped this was one of those hit-and-miss thunderstorms so prevalent in Georgia, but the storm grew louder and more intense, with the booming thunder shaking the earth and the torrential rain drenching everything, even through the thick trees. It was then that I heard it, a low moan drifting out of the bottom of the ravine. At first I thought it must be some wounded animal or perhaps a dog lost in the storm. But as it grew louder and louder, I realized the voice was definitely human. Soon I heard other agonizing moans. They seemingly fed off the horrifying thunder crashing around me. Then I smelled a repugnant odor that I can only describe as the smell of rotten flesh. It must be from a dead animal, I thought, desperately trying to rationalize what I was experiencing. But the odor seemed to grow stronger and stronger as the moans grew louder. A bolt of lightning suddenly illuminated the forest. In that brief second, I swore I saw a shadow darting through the woods. A human shadow. As the storm reached its crescendo, the intense lightning lit the forest like some harsh fluorescent light. The gnarled trees took on odd and terrifying shapes. My blood ran cold as I spotted more of these shadows darting among the trees, as if fleeing in terror from the storm. In the bright flashes of lightning, I began to notice details in the shadows. A military cap here, a rifle or bayonet there. They could only be one thing, soldiers, but the worst was yet to come. The temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees around me. I was hit with the most sick and agonizing sensation I had ever felt. It was like a feeling of devastating loss and pain, as if I had learned my entire family had suddenly died at the same time. I couldn't take it anymore. I kicked the car door open and hopped out into the storm. Then a debilitating feeling of exhaustion hit me, racing through my whole body, as if I had walked 100 miles. I left all my equipment behind and desperately clawed and sputtered through the rain-drenched forest until the cemetery was finally in sight. As I burst free of the forest, the storm inexplicably stopped. The clouds blew away, and I found myself standing in the midst of the glowing white tombstones. I had seen enough, so I crossed the street and ran back to my car, only to spot the silhouette of a man standing beside it, peering into the windows. I stood frozen in my tracks until he yelled out in a warm, inviting Georgia drawl, "Hello there. I was getting worried about you." It was the minister of the church. He had come out to check the building after the storm and had discovered my car. Load maps and Civil War books scattered across the seats had betrayed me as the tourist I was. I tried to avoid telling him what I was doing in new hope by commenting on the thunderstorm that passed and how I had never experienced such a ferocious storm. The minister chuckled and replied, "Yeah, we seem to get them this time of year, especially on this date. Some folks think this place is haunted, but I don't believe in such things." My blood suddenly ran cold, and I heard myself ask him, "What's so special about today?" The minister cocked an eyebrow at me and grinned. "Well, from all those Civil War books in your car, I thought you'd know. Today's May 26th. The Battle of New Hope Church was fought 136 years ago today. And that's my story of the hellhole." Jack's friends always told him he had the ultimate job. For 15 years, he had been working as one of Hollywood's most trusted location scouts. Now, in movie lingo, a location scout is someone hired by a producer to find locations where a movie can be shot. Jack was a seasoned pro who could find even the most obscure locations anywhere in the world. One spring day in 1998, Jack received a script from a major Hollywood studio that sounded like an easy job. The film took place in the 1940s, and many scenes occurred in a ritzy downtown hotel. Since the script also called for scenes in a cypress swamp, Jack decided to take a journey through the American South to see what he could find. Jack had never been to the Deep South before. Since he had plenty of time and was on the studio's payroll, he took a leisurely train ride through the area to absorb this new world. After several weeks of searching, Jack boarded a train for Atlanta. He had found plenty of swampy locations in Louisiana and Mississippi, but still hadn't found the right hotel. Certainly, in the so-called capital of the New South, he could find what he was looking for. The studio made reservations for him at the Barrow Hotel, a historic downtown building that Jack had researched on the internet and figured might work for the film. Jack's train arrived in Atlanta that night in a pounding thunderstorm. Thick sheets of rainwater obscured his view of the city, and power had been knocked out on the streets. Jack waited in the empty depot for his driver, but no one arrived. The only car sitting outside was a restored 1940s-era taxi with the name Hotel Schofield painted on the side. Sick of waiting, Jack marched up to the taxi and tapped on the window. The window rolled down and Jack was surprised to find that the young driver was dressed in a 1940s-era cabbie uniform. "Excuse me, I don't mean to bother you," said Jack. "But could you tell me how far the Barrow Hotel is from here? Why on earth would you want to go there?" asked the driver in an incredulous though mannered tone of voice. Jack explained that he was looking for a film location in Atlanta. The driver shook his head and replied, "You won't have any luck there. They just renovated it a few months ago. Now it looks like every other modern hotel round here." Taken aback, Jack replied, "But I saw their website, and it looked like—" "I don't know what you're talking about, mister," interrupted the driver. "But that's the way Atlanta is. They tear down historic buildings left and right. A crying shame if you ask me. Now, I don't mean to push my hotel on you, but the Schofield may be what you're looking for. It's one of the few old hotels that's still standing. They're kind of busy this time of year, but they might have one more room." Cold and drenched, Jack quickly hopped into the cab. "You got a deal," he said. "Anything to get out of this rain." As the taxi rumbled through the dark Atlanta streets, Jack noticed that the interior of the cab was in great shape, but not overly so. It didn't look like it was restored as much as it was used carefully. Jack had worked on cars long enough to know that from the sound of the engine. The Hotel Schofield must have taken great care of its tax fleet. After what seemed like hours of driving through the misty darkness, the cab finally pulled up to a brightly lit building. "Here we are, sir," said the driver as he pulled beside the doors. Jack got out and his eyes widened immediately. The Hotel Schofield was a grand 15-floor brick edifice very much in the style of 1940s luxury hotels. It was a solidly built, narrow building with a golden awning, red carpet and gas lamps glowing warmly in the foggy night. The doorman smiled at Jack and opened the door into the lush lobby. Sparkling crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, red velvet curtains flowed over the windows, and plush chairs and sofas invited weary guests to relax in luxury. Jack smiled as he looked around. He had hit the jackpot. The hotel, like the taxicab, did not appear to be as well restored. The management seemed to take great pride in transporting its guests to another time. It would work perfectly for the film. Jack walked up to the front desk, which was made of deep blue marble with polished gold trim, and asked the manager for a room. The slightly plump man smiled warmly and replied, "Well, we tend to be busy this time of year, but we might have one more room." After checking the registry, the manager said, "You're in luck. We have a room available on the top floor. Best view of the city." With that, he signaled a bellhop to grab Jack's bags. As Jack followed him toward the elevator, he noticed something strange. The guests in the lobby wore fancy evening wear. The men in tuxedos, the women in long vintage dress. There were also soldiers milling about in green, World War II-looking uniforms, grabbing the attention of the giggling single ladies. Champagne was flowing everywhere. Children in their best suits and dresses ran laughing around their parents' legs. They all smiled warmly at Jack as he walked by. "I wandered into a costume party," thought Jack. "Or worse, is someone already shooting a movie here?" Jack heard a piano player playing the standard Auld Lang Syne in the smoky cocktail lounge. Then he noticed the decorations. A giant Christmas tree glowing brilliantly in the main sitting area, a wreath hanging over the fireplace, greenery with red bows draped over the railings. Nothing unusual, except that it was mid-April. It was then that Jack froze in his tracks. Across the fireplace was a huge banner that read, Happy New Year 1946. At the end of the hall, the golden elevator doors suddenly swung open. Inside was a car full of holiday revelers, all smiling warmly at Jack. One of the men reached out his hand and said, "Come on up, buddy. I think there's room in here for one more." Jack didn't move. Something was definitely odd about this place. It was better to stay somewhere where he felt comfortable. "That's all right," he said to the man. "You go on." The festive piano music suddenly stopped, leaving an eerie silence. Jack heard a rustling sound behind him. He turned and saw that the party crowd had gathered behind him, still smiling. The man in the elevator reached out again for Jack and said, "You don't understand. We have room in here for one more." The crowd suddenly closed in behind Jack. Jack was not an easily scared man, but he was impulsive. He whirled around and charged back through the crowd. Two soldiers grabbed his arms and dragged him back to the elevator. The room began to spin around them, and Jack could swear he saw the Christmas decorations starting to melt. The walls morphed into a sooty black color, and the stinging smell of smoke was everywhere. "Come on, friend," said the smiling man in the elevator. "There's no need to fight. I told you, there's room for one more." Horrifying screams filled the room, but the revelers stood silent, the same silly grins plastered on their faces. The room heated up rapidly to an unbearable temperature. Black smoke now filled the air, and Jack's blood ran cold as he realized that the place was on fire, but no one wanted to leave. With every ounce of strength he had, Jack wriggled free of the soldiers and charged back through the crowd, knocking over anyone who stood in his way. Hands grabbed desperately at his clothes through the blinding smoke, the screams deafening. Suddenly, the ground dropped beneath Jack's feet. He tumbled down the lobby stairs, his head smashing against the marble floor. The room spun wildly around him, then went black. Moments later, Jack opened his eyes. He found himself lying on a dirty floor littered with garbage, chipped marble, and broken glass. He sat up dizzily, wiped the trickle of blood from his forehead, and gazed around the room. He was shocked to find that the ornate hotel lobby had fallen into ruin long ago. The windows were broken out, and the rooms were black and gutted. Vagrants had spray-painted graffiti on the walls. "Hey!" shouted a gruff voice behind him. Jack whirled around to find a police officer standing in the doorway, his hand on his gun. "What are you doing in here?" "I don't know," was all Jack could say. The policeman studied Jack for a minute, then helped him to his feet. "Did somebody attack you?" he asked. "No, sir," answered Jack. "I just checked in here a few hours ago, and hesitation." "What do you mean checked in?" asked the policeman. "This hotel hasn't been open since the Great Fire years ago." Jack suddenly turned pale and asked, "What fire?" "Just the worst hotel fire in use history," said the policeman. "Didn't you see the historic marker outside? Over 100 people died here. They said this place was fireproof. You know, kind of like they said the Titanic was unsinkable. But they were obviously wrong." Jack looked about the room in disbelief as the policeman continued. Most of the folks who survived were on the lower floors. Our fire department didn't have ladders tall enough back then to reach the top floors. It was a horrible sight. "When did it happen?" asked Jack, almost afraid of the answer. The policeman scratched his head and said, "I believe it was New Year's Eve, 1946. Shh! Do you hear that? The sound of footsteps, not human footsteps, but something that only walks at night and visits you in places where you ought not to be, like graveyards. You can hear them sometimes snuffling when you get too close to the graves of their loved ones or whining. You especially don't want to stay when you hear the growling. And if they decide to let you see them, you never want to look into their glowing red eyes. 'Cause that's when they get you. The dogs. Graveyard dogs. Joseph Blakely had been scared by that story all his life and wondered if it had, in fact, come from Widow Morris. He never forgot it or her. She lived on the top of a hill in an old house. Some said it was a haunted house, but as Joseph Blakely grew from a boy into a man of 14, he figured no self-respecting ghost would spend 10 seconds in a house with that woman. It didn't matter if it was a mean ghost or a vindictive one. Widow Morris was meaner. It didn't even matter if the ghost made an awful noise by moving furniture in the middle of the night. The widow was louder and stronger, and she rarely slept. But as bad-tempered as she was, she couldn't compare to her live-in companion, the old goat, for that's what he was, an old goat. He went by the name of Emerson. They were the kind ones who called him that. Others used names that Joseph Blakely couldn't repeat, even though the seat of his breeches carried many mendings, thanks to Emerson's difficult disposition. You see, Joseph Blakely had made it his life's work to bother the widow and her old goat. He couldn't explain why he had to do it, and even if he wanted to, he couldn't stop himself. So whenever an idea popped into his head, he acted on it. Like the time he smelled the blackberry pie and followed his nose to the windowsill, figuring if the widow had no intentions of sharing that pie, why she wouldn't have put it there in the first place. He had barely stuck his finger through the warm crust when Emerson appeared, his beard twitching and his yellow teeth bare. And then came the widow with a broom she used to swat Joseph all the way back to town, and he'd never forget the time he dashed up the steps in the dark of night to throw a rock through the widow's window. But since he forgot the incantation for protection, it was no wonder he didn't get her goat. But rather, her goat got him, until her broom sent him running for cover behind a stand of old oaks. And maybe it was a trick of the moonlight, but with red eyes as big as those of an owl, the widow stared into the night and spoke words that still sent a shiver down his spine. "I'll get you for this, Joseph Blakely. You know I will." And still, the trouble kept coming, with plans for even more. But as plans have a way of going, they went astray 2 months later, when word came that the widow and the old goat had passed away. So Joseph decided he would just have to see her grave for himself. Only then could he let the plans in his mind rest. One very dark night, he set out for the graveyard. He paid little mind to the idea of graveyard dogs, since it was a story that scared little boys. Not a man of 14 like himself, but to be on the safe side, he had practiced the incantation all day. Nothing could get him now. With a lit torch, he peered from one grave to another until he found one of the widows. Next to her was a stone that said simply, Emerson. "Well, I'll be," he said. "She's even buried next to the old goat." Suddenly, a snuffling sound came out from behind the headstone. Was that a graveyard dog? So following the incantation, he whirled once and whispered, "Begone." Then came the whine. "Begone," he said, whirling a second time. And then he heard the growl, "Don't look into the eyes, because that's when they get you." So Joseph Blakely did what any young man with a lick of sense would do. He dropped his lit torch and ran, screaming, from the graveyard. A hand reached out to pick up the torch, and the voice that made the snuffling and the whine let loose with a girlish giggle. Widow Morris knew that one day she would get Joseph Blakely just as she promised, and just as she planned from the day when she, in fact, first told the story. That growl was perfect. "Emerson," she said. Emerson. But the old goat was gone. It seemed he had done what any goat with a lick of sense would do when something was strange and hightailed it out of the graveyard. It was then that she heard a different kind of growl, and when the graveyard dog chose to let her see it, she made the mistake of looking into its glowing red eyes. In every story, there's a grain of truth and the opportunity for a lick of sense. So, no matter what you hear in a graveyard on a very dark night, watch out for those eyes. Back where I grew up in central Alabama, there's an old rock quarry deep in the piney woods, abandoned long ago by a mining company. Ask a local and they'll direct you to an overgrown dirt road just off the highway past the old service station. Follow that road till the end and you'll wind up at the edge of a deep, jagged crater. At the bottom of that crater is one of the best swimming holes you're ever likely to see. Clean, deep blue water is just waiting to cool you off on a hot summer day. But don't be fooled. None of the locals would dare swim in it these days, especially at night when there's a full moon out. Everyone says the lake is cursed, and the truth is, I'm partly to blame for it. Back when I was a boy, we all got word one day that the county's largest employer, the Reynolds Mineral Company, had gone bankrupt and was moving out. This was bad news for our parents, who work the mines for years and were already struggling to get by. But for us boys, halfway through our high school years, it was the best news we'd ever heard. You see, in those days, we didn't have video games, the internet, or shopping malls to keep us amused. When you grew up deep in the country, you had to make your own fun. So with that blazing Alabama sun beating down on us every summer, our quest became to find the next great swimming hole. We knew the Reynolds Mineral Company used a huge lake in their quarry for mining operations. So as soon as the last Reynolds truck rolled away from the site on closing day, we quickly made our plans. We decided to cut off the last day of school and head out to the swimming hole. Although the quarry was several miles deep in the woods, we didn't want the sheriff coming out to the site, which he just might have done if we waited until the weekend. 8 of us went out to the lake that day. Marty, Jeff, and I were best friends and the oldest of the bunch. The rest were a bunch of younger boys we barely knew and didn't want to tag along with, but they threatened to tell us if we didn't. Marty snuck a couple of cases of beer away from his dad, while Jeff took his brother's truck. As soon as we were out of our parents' eyesight, we ditched our school books and took off, us older boys in the cab and the 5 kids in the back. As we drove toward the old mining company turnoff, we passed back and forth a couple of times, trying not to draw attention from passing cars. But when the coast was clear, Jeff gunned his truck down that long, wooded road. He laughed and hollered as the truck bounced wildly on the rough road, tossing those brat kids around in the back like a bunch of rag dolls. After a mile or so, the road leveled out, and I gazed out at the endless rows of pine trees zipping past us. I remember the woods seemed to close in on us the deeper we went, enveloping us in a thick blanket of pine branches. Even with all the laughter and the roar of the truck, I remember how still those woods were. Not a single plane could be heard overhead. Not a bird chirping, nor a fly buzzing. No natural sound at all. Just rows and rows of trees stretching endlessly into the dark forest beyond. I wondered who, or what, must live back there in the darkness. "Hey, wake up, spaceman," yelled Marty, cramming a cold beer into my hand. I smiled and took a big swig, my anticipation building once again. The road suddenly ended at a locked gate with an ominous no trespassing sign. But the simple padlock was no match for Jeff. Jeff had learned a thing or two about picking locks from his older brother, who was constantly in and out of jail for petty burglaries of some sort. So Jeff whipped out one of his mother's hairpins and, in no time at all, picked that lock and tossed it in the woods. Jeff rammed his truck through the gate and roared back down the road, howling with laughter. We then zipped by an old, rusted sign that read Reynolds Mineral. About time, I thought. It seemed like those woods would never— "Damn it!" Jeff screamed, slamming on his brakes. Beer splashed all over my shirt. "What's wrong with you?" I yelled at him. Then we all looked out the window, just mere feet from the truck. The earth opened up without warning into a massive crater, yawning up at the open blue sky with a big mouth of jagged, rocky teeth. At the bottom was the deep, cool lake we'd heard about, its glassy surface undisturbed, not a ripple on it, as if waiting all this time just for us. Faster than you can say abandon ship, we jumped out of that truck, scurried to the bottom of the crater, stripped down to our skivvies, and dove into the cool water. We laughed, yelled and splashed around, our voices bouncing off the towering rock walls around us. We knew there wasn't a soul around who could hear us. As the blazing sun passed overhead, the beers we'd been drinking all day got to our heads. We wobbled around the lake's edge on jello legs, barely staying upright on the slick rocks. I can't say I remember much about that afternoon, so it goes without saying, I didn't notice when one of the younger boys named Logan suddenly wandered off. "Hey, help! I need help!" screamed one of the younger boys. I looked over at him, jumping frantically up and down on a pile of rocks near the shoals. This must be a trap, I thought. Soon as I come over there, he and his brat friends are going to push me into the water. But then I saw the fear in his eyes and I knew this was no joke. "Get over here quick," he screamed. "Logan's hurt." We rushed over to the rocks and peered down at the shoals. There, crumpled up on the rocks, lay Logan, unconscious and pale as a sheet, blood streaming from his forehead. He had never touched the water, slipping on his way down. None of us knew a thing about CPR or any kind of medical training. All Jeff could think to do was pick up Logan, shake him, and scream over and over again, "Wake up! Wake up!" But Logan didn't wake up, and we didn't feel him breathing. None of us really knew what to do. So Jeff laid him back on the ground, and we all stood there, staring in silent disbelief at little Logan's lifeless body. Then panic slowly started to creep in. Now there's a world of difference between fear and panic. You can sometimes think your way out of logicality, but panic is a different story. And if you're a panicked, drunk, and naive teenage boy, you have a real good chance right then and there of making some stupid life decisions. "We're going to get in a lot of trouble," Jeff finally muttered after what seemed like hours. "We go for help. They're going to know we're trespassing, and we've been drinking too. They're going to think we helped kill this kid, giving him beer and all. So what do we do?" I heard myself ask. Jeff didn't hesitate. "We're going to have to hide his body. For all we know, he ran away from home, and we haven't seen him since. That's what we'll say if anyone asks." Some of the younger kids began to sniffle and cry. Jeff looked into their eyes and knew they might not go along with his plan. He glared at them and said, "You kids say anything about it, I'll tell your parents, the sheriff, or whoever else that you pushed him off their rocks. You'll be in jail for the rest of your lives, or maybe the army. It'll be my word against yours. Understand?" One by one, the young boys nodded their heads. "We're going to have to make a pact," Jeff said to all of us. "We do this. Nobody can ever say anything about it. For the rest of our lives." We never signed any binding contract that day, but our scared glances at one another were enough agreement. So Jeff fetched a long chain from the truck and wrapped it around Logan's body. We carried his body into the water and dove in as deep as we could, dragging him down with us. We found a large rock underwater and tied Logan tightly to it. Remember Logan's eyes staying shut as we buried him in his watery tomb, with no expression on his face whatsoever. Maybe he was at peace, I thought to myself, and he could care less what we were doing to him. We emerged from the water, gasping for breath, and marched quickly back to the truck, grabbing Logan's clothes along with our own. Then we made the long, silent journey back home, leaving that swimming hole of death far behind. As the next few days passed, I can't say I was racked with guilt over what happened to Logan. Maybe it was the beer or just plain denial, but it was as if the whole thing was just one bad dream. Even if it wasn't, the kid did it to himself, I reckon. Soon afterwards, we got a huge summer rainstorm. One of those storms the South is famous for, when days of humid, unbearable heat are blasted away by a real frog strangler of a storm. I knew that storm was filling up the swimming hole and washing away every trace of us. Our footprints, tire tracks, whatever else we carelessly left behind. I'll be damned, I thought. We're actually going to get away with this. Then one day, my father walked into my room with a dead serious look on his face. He asked if I knew Logan. I didn't lie. I told him he went to my school, but was younger than me, so I didn't give him the time of day. Then Dad told me the police had been out to the old Reynolds quarry. How they ended up out there, I never found out. But they had found Logan's body. I played it cool, asking Dad how this kid, Logan, died. "He drowned," Dad answered. "Somebody chained his body underwater." I could only stare back at my dad in silent disbelief. He gave me a tight hug, thinking I was in shock. And I was, but not for the reasons he thought. It was then that I knew the awful truth. Logan was alive when he fell on the shoals. We had all drowned him. We were all officially murderous. From that day forward, none of us who went out to the swimming hole that day spoke to one another. We always thought the police would ask questions, but they never did. The discovery of Logan's body had made our silent pact even stronger. Our classmates treated us the same as always, with no suspicion in their eyes. After graduation a couple of years later, I moved away to Memphis, Tennessee, landing a job at a local manufacturing plant. I married and had 2 kids of my own. As far as I was concerned, those bad memories were buried with my old life back in Podunk, Alabama. That is, until I fall asleep at night. Then I would find myself standing on that familiar dirt road deep in the piney woods, the trees silent, all life sucked out of the air. Not a bird, not an airplane, not a fly buzzing. just silence, and those dark woods would beckon me forward, though I knew exactly what was waiting for me at the end. I would reach the swimming hole, wade slowly into the water, and then dive into the murky depths. There at the bottom, Logan waited for me, still chained to that rock, still a young boy. But this time his eyes were open, staring coldly into mine. His mouth didn't move, but I could hear a voice coming from him, and it was always the same sinister whisper. "I'm coming for you. I'm coming for you." One morning, my wife woke me from this daily nightmare to tell me I had a phone call. Even after having the same dream for so long, I would still wake up a frightened man, my eyes bloodshot, skin clammy, and bedsheets soaked with sweat. With shaking hands, I took the receiver. I was shocked at the voice I heard on the other end. It was Jeff calling me for the first time in 15 years, but he wasn't calling to talk about the good old days. He quickly asked me if I had been in touch with any of the boys from that night. "Strange things are going on," he said. "It turns out that the other boys who were with us that night had gone missing. Everyone had moved to different towns, but the story was the same. They each woke up one day, went to work or some other place, and never came back. Police were called and missing persons cases were filed, but no one ever returned. It was as if they had just been snatched off the face of the earth, but Jeff wasn't buying it. He told me about the dreams he was having, of young Logan staring at him with impassive eyes in his watery grave, whispering the same mantra, 'I'm coming for you. I'm coming for you.' I didn't have the heart to tell Jeff that I was having the same dream. I managed some weak words of encouragement, but panic was beginning to creep in. That was the last time I ever spoke to Jeff. Several days later, he left his Birmingham home to grab a beer with friends and disappeared. His car was never found, nor was his body. Like the others, he had simply vanished. I knew then that I was last on the list, and Logan was coming for me. There was only one place I knew where I might be safe. So one morning, I hugged my wife and kids and told them I was going to visit my parents back in Alabama. I had no intention of going home. I went straight to the county police station and confessed everything. But even this many years later, as I write you this story behind bars, deep within the bowels of a high-security prison, I still don't feel safe. Logan still visits me in my dreams, and I listen for his tiny, wet footsteps to come walking down the hall one night, to drag me deep into those dark woods, back to the dark waters of the Reynolds mineral quarry, to face the judgment that no earthly law can provide. Oh, and what about the old swimming hole? After news got out about Logan's death, the county built tough new security fences around the crater to discourage any future would-be swimmers. But they could have saved their tax dollars, for the locals were too scared to venture out there. But every once in a while, you'll hear about a ghost hunter, a thrill seeker, or some other crazy person who makes the long journey out there to see where our notorious crime took place. And they come back describing an odd and terrifying sight. When the moon is full, they swear that they see a reflection in that still black water below, in the shape of a skull near the spot where Logan died. That's why that notorious swimming hole now carries the name Skull Lake. Pastor Fitch was a serious and humble man, a mite lacking in the humour department, but still a pleasant sort of fellow who was always confident that the good Lord was standing by his side. He was working hard not to let pride overcome him this night as he drove his lovely, young bride, Sarah Sue, toward their honeymoon suite in New Orleans. Gazing across the horse-drawn wagon at her, he admired her beauty, appreciating what a fine pastor's wife she would become, with a little guidance. Soon after they crossed into Louisiana, a hard rain suddenly poured down upon them. At first, the good pastor kept on going. Nothing was going to stop him from having a blissful honeymoon with his beloved. But as the cold rain came down harder and harder, he figured he'd better find shelter for the night. By the side of the road, he spotted a small, run-down house with a light on in the window. He pulled up the driveway, knocked on the door, and asked the elderly woman inside if she had a spare room. The elderly woman shook her head, then pointed toward a winding dirt road that disappeared into a thick, menacing-looking forest. "There's a pretty big house up that road," she said. "It's empty. People there moved out a long time ago. Nobody'll care if you stay there, but I wouldn't recommend it." "Why not?" asked the teacher. "'Cause some strange things happen up there," she answered. "They say the place is haunted." The preacher smiled and patted the well-worn Bible under his arm. "No ghosts will harm me, ma'am," he said. "I'm a man of God." The elderly woman chuckled and said, "Yeah, do what you want. Just don't say you weren't warned." Pastor Fitch and his wife rode up the long, bumpy dirt road, the thick oak trees sheltering them from the rain. Soon they spotted a large, gloomy-looking mansion peeking out of an overgrown yard. Thick strands of kudzu covered the weather-beaten stone walls, but for the most part, the house was in reasonably good shape. The couple got off the wagon and slowly opened the rotted door, its rusty hinges creaking loudly. Inside the dark, musty house, they could see that most of the furniture was still inside, covered in dust. A large stone fireplace filled the living room. Long hallways led to other darkened rooms, but they had no interest in finding out what lurked in the house's unseen depths. The pastor gathered some wood and started a roaring fire. Even though the warmth felt heavenly, the flickering flames cast eerie shadows on the empty walls and high ceilings, making the spooky house even more sinister. The pastor sat his shivering wife in front of the fire, handed her his Bible, and suggested she read some selected verses to combat any fears she might experience. After an hour of sitting by the fire, the couple suddenly heard a strange noise from somewhere in the darkness. It sounded like faint footsteps walking up and down a distant hallway, pacing anxiously. "Do you hear that?" asked Sarah Sue. "It's nothing, dear," answered the pastor, working on notes for a future sermon. "Read your Bible." The footsteps grew louder and louder, as if they were walking down the hallway toward them. Sarah Sue looked at her husband, but he kept his face buried in his notes, writing furiously. The footsteps then entered the room. Sarah Sue looked anxiously around but could see nothing. What followed next chilled her blood, a low, painful moan filling the cavernous room with its misery. "Dear," started Sarah Sue. "Ignore it," said the pastor. "Read your Bible." As a footstep circled her chair, the moan growing louder and more anguished. Her hands shook as she flipped the dog-eared pages of her Bible, reading the most inspirational, evil-fighting passages out loud with uncommon fervor. The front door then slammed and slammed again, over and over, until it completely flew off its hinges. A fierce wind blew into the home, snuffing out the large fire and plunging the room into total darkness. "Dear," yelled Sarah Sue. "I said, ignore it," blurted the pastor. "Keep reading your Bible." The howling wind roared through the house, knocking over lamps, dishes, statues, and books. Sarah Sue read her verses louder and louder, while the pastor wrote furiously. Suddenly, the noise stopped. Sarah Sue turned and looked at her husband. He smiled back and said, "See, I told you no harm would come to us. The word of God is like a sword by your side." No sooner had these words escaped his lips when a heavy object fell down the chimney with a large thump. It rolled into the center of the room between the pastor and his wife. They looked at each other for a moment, then the pastor struck a match and held it down toward the object. It was a man's bloody head. What was left of its worm-eaten flesh hung in thin strands off its cheekbones. To the pastor's horror, the head opened its eyes and began to speak. "Lord Almighty," it said, "what's it take to get some attention round here?" Sarah Sue shrieked and fainted dead away on the floor. The teacher stood and clutched the cross around his neck. "Back away, you demon of hell," he screamed. "I'm a man of God." The head rolled its eyes. "Easy, preacher man," it said. "You broke into my house, remember? What are you doing here anyway?" "My wife and I were caught in a rainstorm," the teacher answered. "We're on our honeymoon. This is the only shelter we could find until the storm cleared." The teacher suddenly remembered his wife and rushed over to revive her. "Wait," said the head. "You may want to hear what I have to say before you wake her up." The teacher glared at the head. "I'm not interested in anything you have to say. You're obviously a cursed spirit." The head laughed and replied, "Ain't that the truth? And I'll tell you why. A few years ago, I, too, married a beautiful young woman. I wasn't the most handsome man in the world, but I did have a lot of money, as you can see by this nice home you've so conveniently broken into. I was so blinded by love that it never occurred to me that this woman might have married me just for my money. But sure enough, a few months into our marriage, she started disappearing from me. Her errands in town took a little longer than usual. There were whispers in town that she had found another man, but I didn't believe them. "Oh no," I said, "not my lovely wife." Then one night, I was awakened by my wife coming home at a very late hour. But she wasn't alone. She was with her new lover, a muscular young man who worked down at the mill. They stabbed me to death and cut off my head. Then they buried my headless body out in the woods. The head then grinned, its brittle jaw making a gruesome cracking sound. But I got the last laugh, it said. You see, what they really wanted was my stash of gold that I kept hidden in the house. They tore the place apart, looking for it, but couldn't find it. So they fled the county empty-handed. That gold's still in this house, and I'm the only one who knows where it is. As the head said this, the teacher backed away from his unconscious wife and sat attentively on the floor. The head sighed wearily and said, "I'm tired, preacher man. I can't find peace until my head is buried with my body. If you'll bury me out in the woods with my body, I'll give you all my gold plus the house." The teacher's eyes sparkled for a moment. "Show me where the gold is," he said, "and I promise I'll do as you ask, and it'll be a decent Christian burial." The head smiled and said, "It's buried in the fireplace. There's a pickaxe down in the cellar." The preacher ran down to the cellar, found the pickaxe, then ran back up and frantically hammered away at the massive fireplace, his face drenched with sweat. The head shouted words of encouragement, egging him to dig further. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the preacher's axe struck a wooden chest deep in the rock. He yanked it out, bashed open the lock, and found that, sure enough, it was filled with gold. The teacher then picked up the head with a shovel and went out into the yard. The head directed him to a mound of earth deep in the woods. The preacher dug inside and found a headless corpse, still dressed in its bloody nightgown. The teacher set the head beside the corpse and started flinging dirt back into the grave. As he did, he could hear the head yell up to him, "Remember what I said, preacher man. Don't be blinded by love." As the years went by, the young couple settled into the house and lived a life of domestic bliss. The preacher founded a church and became one of the most beloved men in the community. But deep in the woods, just a few yards from the unmarked grave, the preacher buried that chest of gold, far away from his wife's curious eyes, just in case. When folks think about the American South, one image that always comes to mind is the old plantation house. Before the Civil War devastated the South, its plantation homes were about the closest thing America had to magical European palaces. But what some folks don't know, or maybe don't care to think about, is that many of these plantations were built on the backs of slaves. These slaves toiled under the whip of the white plantation owners, harvesting cotton and sugarcane for days, weeks, and months on end. Some were literally worked to death, only to be replaced like an old shoe when the next boatload of captured slaves came into port. So while the plantations may have been wealthy palaces to some, they were places of misery and death to others. So it should come as no surprise that many of the plantation homes remaining in the South are rumored to be haunted. This is the story of one of those houses. Back in the 1800s, many plantations were located north of New Orleans along the banks of the Mississippi River. These plantations fueled the national economy with cotton and sugar cane, and their owners were some of the richest men in America. Myrtle's Plantation, located a few miles outside of St. Franceville, Louisiana, was one of these homes. It was a beautiful example of old South antebellum architecture. Upon arrival, a visitor would be greeted with the magical sight of Spanish moss, swaying in the breeze, sweeping wide verandas with ornamental ironwork, and the sweet smells of pink-blossomed myrtle trees. Inside, one would find a lavishly decorated home in the Gothic style, with ornate plasterwork, European antiques, winding staircases, and sparkling crystal chandeliers. But all this beauty hid a very sinister history, which many believe started with a Myrtle Plantation slave girl named Chloe. At that time, Myrtle's plantation was owned and operated by Judge Clark Woodruffer and his wife, Sarah Matilda. The Woodruffs had two young daughters, with a third child on the way. The judge was well respected in the community as a man of integrity and a staunch upholder of the law, but he also held a dirty secret. He was a compulsive womanizer. Whenever he had the opportunity, the judge would sneak around and have relations with his female slaves. Chloe, a slave of mixed blood who served as governess to the Woodriffe children, eventually became the target of his advances. Chloe was disgusted with the thought of the judge having his way with her, but she knew if she didn't follow through, she would probably be sent back out to toil in the fields with the other slaves. Working in the big house was as close to freedom as a slave could expect at that time, so Chloe did what she had to do. But after a while, Chloe began to suspect that the judge was getting tired of her and would soon be looking for a new lover. Terrified of being sent back to the fields, Chloe began eavesdropping on the family's conversations to find out if her fears were true. One day, the judge caught her and was so enraged that he grabbed her and sliced off one of her ears. From that day forward, Chloe wore a green turban around her head to hide her shameful wound. With the judge now furious at her, Chloe knew she had to do something fast to prove her worth to the family. But what? Her opportunity came one day when she was directed to help set up a birthday party for the Woodruffe's eldest daughter. The judge was away, and his wife and daughters planned on celebrating the birthday by eating cake in the dining room. Chloe came up with a plan. She crept outside and picked up one of the oleander plants growing beside the house. The leaves of this plant contained a small amount of poison, which she secretly added to the birthday cake. She figured if she made the family sick, she could nurse them back to health and prove herself invaluable to the family. She cared for the children and was careful to only add enough poison to make them slightly ill. As the family ate the tainted birthday cake, Chloe soon found out she had made a terrible mistake. One by one, they dropped their utensils and began writhing and moaning in agony. Chloe helped them to their beds and tried desperately to save them, but it was too late. Soon the young girls, their mother, and her unborn child were all dead. As word spread throughout Myrtle's plantation, the other slaves were terrified that the judge would take his anger at Chloe out on them. To save their own hides, they knew that they had to do something to prove their loyalty to their master. So one night, a lynch mob grabbed Chloe while she slept and hanged her from one of the oak trees. After she died, they cut her down, weighted her body with rocks, and tossed her into the Mississippi River. The judge promptly sealed off the dining room and never used it again. In later years, the plantation house was turned into a bed and breakfast, with many visitors attracted to its beauty and Old South charm. But visitors and future owners alike would soon discover that they were not alone in the house. One day, one of the new owners of Myrtle's plantation snapped a photo of the front of the house. When the picture was developed, she could see a shadowy figure standing near the veranda, her head wrapped in what appeared to be a turban. At night, some of the guests reported hearing restless footsteps wandering the hallways of the house. Others said they were jolted from their sleep by a black woman in a green turban who lifted up the mosquito net around their beds as if looking for someone. Soon, other strange incidents were reported in the house. Some guests claimed to have seen the images of small children in the hallway mirrors. Others heard their names called out from distant rooms, only to find they were alone in the house, and others spotted two playful little girls in white dresses playing in the hallways, peeking through the windows, bouncing on the beds, even swinging from the chandeliers. Is the mysterious woman in the green turban the ghost of Chloe, searching for the judge who caused her such grief? Are the mysterious little girls the ghosts of the Woodruffey children, forever trapped in the home where they died? We'll leave that up to you to decide. Or, better yet, next time you're in Louisiana, spend a night at Myrtle's plantation near St. Francisville and find out for yourself